So this is one of those talks where you really want to say something, but you're not sure how you're going to be able to do something useful in only 10 minutes and not get into a million details. So we're going to try, well, I'll try this. And you guys, as usual, will give me feedback to tell me whether this had any value. And the problem is whatever advice you give has to be adjusted to the local culture, right? So it's not necessarily one of those things you can do and give universal advice. So starting off, this seems to happen a lot. You're working on some set of projects. It's a multi-team project or multi-discipline project. Everyone on the project is successful, and yet the project is still a failure. It is kind of mind-blowing, really. This happens a lot, and it can happen for a variety of reasons, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. So that's what my 3 happy faces here. This is like 3 teams are happy, and then it turns out all the management and everybody at the end of the thing's like, man, that didn't work. I was on a project recently, and we probably spent, I don't know, $30-40 million on something, and all the teams were wildly successful, and yet the complete ecosystem that we built really was not very useful, and it was pretty darn unfriendly. It was not pretty. Wasn't my fault. At least I hope it wasn't my fault. It started before I got there. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So how does this work, right? So, and you can see I'm not in presenting mode because you can see the empty images on those. I should have put something there. So you can over plan something, right? And that'll kill a project too. But what Agile's kind of done and what people have wanted to do is you want to decouple the teams. Create as few cross connections as you can. And what this has turned out to be is a bunch of teams will go out and do their work, and they will all move at rapid speed. At the beginning of the project, there'll be a stated goal, and they'll move at rapid speed. And then you wake up like a year later, and it's amazing because all the teams went really fast, and you wake up a year later, and most of the teams did not hit the group stated goal. The project is dead, or you're lying about it. That's the other one. And it's because the teams were decoupled, so they were able to operate without a high amount of friction with other teams, but they actually at the end didn't end up in the same place. They didn't communicate with each other or something else. So nowadays you'll hear this called the AWS model. Amazon's freaking amazing, right? They deliver dozens of services a year, and they do a heck of a job at it. But the reality is a lot of their services don't work together well. It's like pretty mind-blowing. But they can get away with it because they're building blocks. They're building stuff that you use to integrate and make your stuff work, right? So I'm just picking Amazon. I'm assuming you're in the software industry, but this works other places. So they do a heck of a job, right? 1 million services. They're great. And then you glue them all together because they didn't think how they would work together. So you don't actually have a solution, right? You've got a bunch of blocks. But when you build stuff inside of a company, an enterprise, or the government, it actually needs to work together. So the Amazon model is amazing, but it may not actually apply to you. So what do you end up with? You go really quick. And if it's a single team project or 2 teams, it's probably fine. But a lot of times you'll end up with a fast trip to nowhere. You end up some period, a year later, 2 years later, and none of your customers care for what you build. None of them like it, right? And one of the problems with this is a lot of times you'll reward those that push their own goals, right? And everybody else, man, if they cared about this project, after a certain amount of time, they don't care anymore. You killed the care, right? So what we need to do is we want to try and find a way, well, which I won't talk about here, is rewarding the people who are successful but also help others be successful. So what do we want to do? We want the organization to move forward to a unified goal. We'd still like to have as little friction as possible, but just enough that nobody goes off in the wrong direction and you don't wake up in the end and go, wow, those 2 ends of this bridge just didn't come together at all. I think we're going to have to build like some weird thing to make it go across. I used to live in a place where they did that. The 2 bridges were 20 feet apart from each other offset. And when you drive over it, you're like, what is this? And it's because they had to patch the middle of this bridge. So how do we avoid that while still doing the least amount of overhead as possible, right? So what we want to do is we want to create enough structure for the group to succeed, but no more. And that is really hard because actually planning and cross-connecting is really hard work, and it's not very sexy, and you don't get rewarded for it very often, and it's brutal, right? Because there's always a lot of unknowns. So it's a balancing act here. What we're trying to do is we want to enable enough independent action, but we also want to coordinate, right? So on an independent action side, the team can be successful. People like being successful, and they like being successful early and often, and you can get rapid advancement in some parts of the problem. If you're coordinated, you actually have visibility whether this is going to work or not, if people report the right status. And you have some idea whether that, because other teams will be complaining. And you can get cross-team success without personal heroics, right? And there's meaningful advancement of the over project. So some of the things on the sides are advantages and disadvantages, right? The advantage of being independent action is, the teams can focus on their deliverables and not get hung up on everybody else's crap, right? But at the same time, if they only focus on their deliverable, they may not know that these other teams have needs, or the other teams didn't go in that direction, and the two ends of the bridge don't match. And you can get easier tactical success, but the downside is you get easier tactical success. The same thing is on the other side, right? If you're coordinated, you have an attention to shared goals. That can also be bad because it can be a distraction. But you got it. So it's a balancing act trying to figure out how independent you want to be and how coordinated you want to be. I would argue completely independent and highly crazy coordinated, they're both bad. Size matters, right? And the reason size matters is the bigger the project, the more this comes into account. If you've only got 2 teams, they probably don't need a lot of coordination because they can talk to each other all the time. Or maybe 3 teams. If you've got 12 people, whatever it is. So coordination is more important the higher the risk and the bigger the project. And no amount of lying to yourself is going to fix that. So it's all about risk management. You can do nothing and then assume everybody's going to talk to everybody. And I like this diagram on the left because it gives you how much overlap there is. All these teams maybe they don't need to talk to everybody, but they're going to need to talk to a bunch of other teams, and that creates a bunch of risk. If we have a defined dependency process, and here I'm going to call it a program increment, then in theory, everybody knows when they've got to check in. My kids are out. I would like them to check in at 11 o'clock so I can see if they're still alive, right? Kind of the same thing on a software project. So what really drives people crazy about planning is they think meetings are a waste of time. But a bunch of mistakes will kill the project. It could kill the company, right? So what we want to do is we want to retain agility while handling the basic blocking and tackling of interdependencies and keeping our eye on the ball, at least farther down the road, right? That they have this combined goal. So what I would recommend is really a well-managed regular cadence. You got to figure out a way to create muscle memory, right? So on one side, you could do meetings that are ad hoc. You only hold them when they're needed. No time is wasted. There's no pointless ceremony. The teams just do what they need to do. And the big argument for this is there's more hours for work, right? I don't have any meetings, so I've got more hours for work. You also have more hours for rework, which is great. And the argument here is if I just hire good people, they'll make this thing happen. And better people do make things happen, but you can also burn them out. A regular cadence lets people know what to expect, right? They know what's still important because sometimes priorities change and not everybody knows. There's also accidental discussions in a cadence if you have a regular cadence for meetings and planning. People will mention something, other people in the room are in the room, and they're going to be like, wow, we didn't know you were doing that, or that's a catastrophe waiting to happen, or maybe we need to talk about that. It also creates muscle memory. The more you do something, the more repetitive, the more it becomes ingrained, and you may not actually have to hold all those cadence meetings later because you've developed a muscle memory around it. But a lot of times it makes sense to keep it because that way you don't fall out. You're either training or you're untraining all the time. And the advantage of the cadence is you get well-defined channels for cross-team dependencies, and that's really what you need. So I guess the end of this is when you do a project, I had something that said optimism is not a plan, right? But optimism is mandatory. We want people to feel good that the project is moving forward, that the work they're doing is moving forward. So we have to manage their individual success and the group success. So optimism is mandatory, but it is not a strategy. We need to do something else. And I would argue that relying on your good people to do all the work it will actually burn them out and cause them to quit because it'll end up being a death march. The notion that you can work once you have more than 2 teams or 3 teams without some level of coordination and regular cadence is foolish, and you're bound to end up with catastrophes like the bridge that ended up 20 yards offset from each other. Leave comments and we'll see what people think. Thanks.